Right. Well, everybody, welcome. We are delighted to welcome you here. I'm trying to do three things at once and admit people to the Zoom as well. But welcome to all of you. My name is Karine Mogg. I am the director here of the Meter Center for Calvin Studies. Our great joy always to welcome you here to these special sessions. Every year, the Meter Center offers fellowships, short-term fellowships to faculty, to graduate students, to pastors in the Reformed tradition. And they come to Grand Rapids from wherever they normally work, and they spend a month to 6 weeks with us doing research with the collections of the Meter Center and the collateral collections in Heckman Library. And it is a wonderful thing that we are able to offer these fellowships and have done so all the way back since 1995, which is a wonderful, wonderful thing to be able to do. Today, we are going to be hearing from two of our visiting scholars for the 2024-25 academic year. Our first presenter is Dr. Emanuel Conțac, who is Associate Professor at the Pentecostal Theological Institute in Bucharest, Romania. He is the recipient of this year's Meter Center Faculty Research Fellowship. He will be presenting for us on Wolfgang Musculus's commentary on Matthew 1546 as the primary theological source of the first Romanian church postil, The Meaning of the Gospel, which was published in 1567. Now, after his presentation and a short time of discussion, we will then turn to our second presenter, Jeb Ralston. Jeb is a PhD student at Trinity International University in Deerfield, Illinois. He is working with Scott Manich, who is known to many of us here, and Scott has had a long association with the Meter Center. He's had fellowships as well with us, so that's kind of really nice, squaring the circle. We congratulate Jeb also on being a recent recipient of a major Fulbright Award for PhD students. He will be going on from here to Switzerland for a year to do research in Geneva on his dissertation and on a contribution to a team project on the exegesis of Paul in the 16th century. His presentation for us today is A Dogmatic Erasmus, ? Original Guilt in Theorobeza's Annotations on Romans 5:12, 1550-98. So, first of all, please join me in welcoming these two speakers. And I'm going to move over, and so that Emanuel can have the central location here, and I'll even move my food out of your little. There you go.
I should be able to.
You should be able to move with the arrows, move the slides back.
And they will see.
They should see it. It's all being shared. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So first of all, I'm very excited to be here and to talk about the.
Okay, the slides behind you are not showing at all. Well, that is.
Let's see.
Let's do slideshow. Yeah, there you go.
Or enable editing, maybe.
I think slideshow first. Let's do slideshow. And then start from the beginning. There you go. Now we're on. Yeah, looks better. Good. Perfect.
So I'll be speaking about the Romanian book of sermons, and I'll try to admit everyone who is still late. This is the Meaning of the Gospels. It's the first postil or collection of sermons in Romanian, and I'd just like to show what it looks like with my annotations. Now, I don't do that with books from the Meter Center. That's not my personal copy. I became intrigued by this collection of sermons during my PhD studies, and what intrigued me was the depth of reflection and fine exegesis which the author displays in the book. And there was in my lizard brain, so to speak, the intuition that he must have used a source probably from Western Europe, because it was in a sense too good for what a Romanian author would have been able to do in the 16th century, mid-16th century. So I postponed research on this book of homilies, and I decided to take a closer look. Let me see if I get the.
I should do it. Let's try again. There you go.
Okay. I decided to take a closer look a few years ago, and especially because this book of sermons has puzzled many scholars, and one professor famously said that the first postil printed by Coresi seems destined to circulate through the history of Romanian literature, enveloped in a cloud of enigmas regarding the date and place of printing, the authors or authors of the translation or compilation, the cultural milieu from which it emerged, and of course the original or originals from which it was translated or compiled. So we had a number of enigmas. I'm happy to say that I managed to solve some of them, but of course we do not know everything that we'd like to know. But we do know that it uses certain reformed sources, such as the commentary of Musculus, on which I will speak. And we know that it was printed in 1567. And you can see on the right a page, it's printed in Cyrillic script because that's what we used till 1859 in Romanian culture. And the author himself, the printer himself, so the Coresi is only the printer, he's an Orthodox deacon. He says in the text at the end of the book that seeing how many priests are eager for the interpretation of the Gospels, so that they too might preach and give people instruction after the reading of the Gospel, I found these interpretations or expositions of the Gospels for Sundays throughout the year, extracted from the scriptures of the prophets and apostles and from the Holy Fathers. And after I read them, I carefully examined and considered them, and I found that they all interpret, confirm, and are in accord with the Holy Scripture, and they were very pleasing to me, and I put them in print for you, my Romanian brethren, to be used for instruction. And then he also adds a disclaimer. He says, if you see that the author criticizes the bad patriarchs or archbishop and priests, you should be aware that he actually criticizes the evil ones, not the good ones. But then you read the book and you wonder where are the good patriarchs and archbishops, because there is a lot of criticism concerning them, and almost all negative stuff is actually directed at the high clergy. But Coresi knows what he's doing. He's also a businessman, so he needs to somehow make sure that people are aware of the criticism inside the book. Now, just a little bit of geographical context. So on the map, you see the Kingdom of Hungary, which was already diminished by the invasion of by the advance of the Turks. So the green part in the lower part of the map shows the region which was already conquered by the Turks. The Kingdom of Hungary itself is now sort of the pinkish region, and the orange part displays the Principality of Transylvania, which originally was part of the larger Kingdom of Hungary, but which after the Battle of Mohacs, when the Hungarians were defeated, Transylvania started to assert its autonomy, and it was under the suzerainty of the Ottoman Empire, but it did have, it became a political actor in its own right throughout the 16th and especially the 17th century. And because it adopted the Reformation, it also became a land which tolerated religious dissent. And it's, as you know, it was quite famous for the fact that it had the only king who was a Unitarian, and religious toleration was possible, at least in certain parts, for a certain period of time. And on the right, you can see the Principality of Moldavia and Wallachia in the south. And Deacon Coresi comes from the south, from an Orthodox country, and his trajectory is basically represented by the yellow arrows. So he moves into Brasov, into a town which is in Transylvania, and he goes there because he's actually invited to print books for the Romanians who live in this town. The magistrates of Kronstadt, of Brasov, have adopted the Reformation as early as 1542-43, and after a few years, after a decade, they sense that they have a responsibility to also do something for the Wallachians, and they decide to print a catechism, to print the Gospels in Romanian, the Acts of the Apostles, the Epistles, and also a book of sermons. And this is the book of sermons that is actually the first one in Romanian literature. And you can also see perhaps a map for a brush off that's from a later century, but it would give you an idea of what the city looked like. It's a typical German town. There are many in Transylvania, and some of them were famous for the introduction of the Reformation, like Hermannstadt or Sibior, Brasov, Kronstadt. And the Germans were particularly interested in promoting the Reformation also among the Greek Orthodox, or the Wallachians, who were Orthodox. And Sibiu, the other city which is close to Brasov, is also famous for the fact that 2 Romanian books were printed there. Now, we do know that among the sources of this collection of sermons is one by Peter Melius Juhas, who was a Hungarian author, a Reformed author, who published a collection of sermons in 1563, selected sermons from the writings of the prophets and the apostles. And we know that one particular homily from this collection was translated, not in entirety, but most of it was translated and included in the Romanian Book of Sermons. And in turn, the Romanian version was used by a Ruthenian or Ukrainian author who compiled the so-called Nagovo Postil. And there was a debate actually whether maybe the Ruthenian version was the original for the Romanian version. But after doing some research with a Hungarian scholar and with a specialist in Ruthenian language, we agreed that actually the Nagovo Postil is based on Romanian and not the way around. So I'll just skip the arguments concerning this and move to Musculus's commentary on Matthew, a book which was used, as I discovered, by the Romanian anonymous author who is behind this postil. So the commentary by Musculus was published in 1544. And you can see just an image of the volume in 3 volumes bound together. Musculus reissued with corrections this commentary, and there are a number of editions, but for my research, I used the 1544 edition. And I'd like to call your attention to homily 47 in the Romanian book, which contains a section which is a sort of encomium in honor of the cross. And I'll show how information from Musculus gets translated and adopted into the Romanian text. And I've retranslated the Romanian into English. On the right hand, you can see the text in English based on Romanian. The author says the cross is of 2 kinds, one of all Christians in general, as Paul says in Galatians 5:24, those who belong to Christ have crucified their body with its passions and desires. Another cross is the one which God assigns to a person individually to bear and suffer, be it illness or other hardships and difficulties. Christ does not speak of bearing the wooden cross that he bore and died on, nor does he speak of the cross made of gold or silver, which easy it is for the hypocrites to bear. And he goes on and adds further biblical passages, and you can see that he actually directs criticism against the hypocrites, who are, of course, the Orthodox clergy in his understanding. Now, when I read this in Romanian, I was intrigued by the fact that he discusses the cross, this twofold aspect of the cross, and decided to see whether I could find something if I did the translation into Latin, and ended up with searching Crux, Christianorum, and Duplex, and set the time limits between 1500 and 1567, the date when the Romanian book was published. And lo and behold, to my surprise, there was Musculus's commentary on Matthew, actually more editions. And the argument and the biblical passages in the Latin text and in the Romanian text matched quite well, but there were of course some differences. And Dr. Mag mentioned that I'm a Pentecostal. You'll hear some speaking in tongues, but it will be only Latin and with interpretation. So Crux Christianorum Duplex Est. That's what actually helped me find the commentary. And Musculus goes on una est omnibus communis de quad Galatas qui Christi sunt, etc., etc. So then you have the discussion about the other cross and what it entails. And you can actually see now on the left hand the page from Musculus, the Crux Christianorum bit is marked in yellow, and then the criticism that he deploys towards the monks and to the papal monks, basically. So I will not read the entire passage, but I'd like just to read half of it. Musculus says there are various forms of illness that are true and only that the true and only physician who knows everything precisely must necessarily impose on anyone for proper treatment. So the physician is Jesus in his understanding. Likewise, he says some choose for themselves the crosses that they want. First, they cannot be said to bear their own crosses in a meaningful sense. And secondly, they take up such crosses that not only do not cure the ailments they suffer from, but even add more strength to it, as we see in the Anabaptists who reject wives and children, and then also in the papal monks. So this is the part that the Romanian author does not include. So he adjusts the text according to his needs. So another aspect which sparked my interest was the reception of the church fathers in the Romanian postil, because for a while, we had in the history of scholarship concerning this book, we had the idea that because we see church fathers quoted in this text, then the author perhaps used, who was Orthodox, used some Protestant materials, and he added some, because he was Orthodox, he decided to also include some church fathers, and other scholars said, no, maybe the initial postil was Orthodox with the church fathers in it, and then a Protestant scholar decided to add the Protestant element. So there were various debates, and that was because people actually did not, Romanian philologists do not understand Reformed theology very well, and the Orthodox scholars likewise do not seem to be acquainted with the Reformed tradition, and they fail to note that actually the Reformed scholars used church fathers quite a lot, and Musculus is one of them, and he quotes John Chrysostom quite often in his commentary on Matthew, and this is why we actually have these quotations in the postil. So he's mentioned quite often in homily 14, 21, 44, 50, and 63. And I have almost done research on all the quotations and discovered the context and where the quotations come from. So I'll give you just an idea. For instance, in the sermon for the 12th Sunday after the Pentecost, we have a discussion about the rich ruler who doesn't want to follow Jesus and give away his wealth. And the author of the meaning of the Gospels quotes Zlatus. Zlatus is actually Chrysostom, who exclaims, I will cry out with a loud voice, just as wealth increases, so does the desire for wealth. And the more wealth a person acquires, the more wretched he becomes. And that's actually from Musculus. You can see on page 461, and the name Chrysostomus is noted in the margin to make the reader aware that he can get a patristic snippet there. In the same context, you actually have a quotation from Basil the Great, and both texts are in the Romanian edition, and they are in the vicinity, just like you find them in Musculus. And it's remarkable that in the commentary on Matthew, Musculus actually includes the Greek text, Pasanten adapanon eulabean and the Ichnumenus. He uses a quotation which says that Basil says that he saw rich people who fasted and prayed and groaned over their sins, yet they did not give a single coin to the poor. And that's also kept in Romanian, but the coin is actually a Romanian coin, so there is an adaptation in that regard. It's not an obolos as in the Greek text. And then I found a quotation which really intrigued me, because in Romanian it looks like John Chrysostom said in that's the Romanian text, and I could just to give you an idea of what Romanian sounds like, I could read just a bit. Ioan Zlatus zice la Matei, în omilia 29 de capete, în tâlc, nu poate sufletul a se despărți de la trup. John Chrysostom in Matthew, in homily 29, in the exposition says, the soul cannot be separated from the body. And in reading that, I was very intrigued. How could the church father say that the soul cannot be separated from the body? Because that's just basic theology, that the soul gets separated from the body. And I said maybe the Romanian editor did a mistake. He closed the quotation in the wrong place, and I decided to look up the Greek text and the Latin text in John Chrysostom, and I discovered that he actually says, "Nor indeed is it possible for a soul torn away from the body to wander here anymore. For the souls of the righteous are in the hand of God, and if of the righteous, then of those children's souls too." So basically, Chrysostom criticizes the superstition in his time that people can murder children to use their souls as somehow to assist them in their magical rituals. So he criticizes this, and he says actually souls of such children would not be able to remain on earth, and because they are righteous, they would be in the hand of God. So it's impossible to believe that any magician or any wizard would be able to make use of them. And this is the context in which he has this quotation. And this is the Latin version published by Froben in 1530. There were a number of editions published by various printers with the Latin text of Chrysostom, and you see he says nec enim potest anima e corpore separata in his regionibus errare, and then the quotation goes to the other yellow or orange bit where Chrysostom says that when they reach their final destination, they just wait for the day of judgment, the souls. And we find this quotation also in Musculus. It's slightly shorter because the Reformed author removes some of the information that it's not necessary for him, and the essential is there. And he basically, that's still the Romanian text, just to give you an idea of how the Romanian reception looks like. Now, the bold words are the additions that the Romanian author includes. So he does include, for instance, a reference like Luke 83. 83 is actually according to the Slavonic system, numbering system. Although we are in 1567, the authors do not use all the time they rarely use the modern, what we would call the modern numbering, the Stephanus, let's call it that way, numbering system or verse division. And in the context of the quotation, we discover that the Romanian author criticizes the Mass for the dead, and before the Chrysostom quote, he says, even in our time, much deceit emerged in the world. They say that the dead come into the house and appear to people asking for help after death, that monks and priests should perform liturgies. He uses the term sărăcuste in Romanian, and many such lies. They say that the demons spoke and said that they were the soul of this or that person only to deceive the fools. And then he adds, after the quotation from John Chrysostom, but Christianity is a lie, what they teach, that is to keep vigil for the dead person after 9 days and at 20 days and at 40 and at the year. It is also a lie that they say it can benefit souls after death, because the place of the soul does not change after this life. Rather, this belief was invented by scribes out of greed. And Sărăcusta, I'm not going into detail, comes from the term for 40. It's actually from Tesarakoste, from Greek, which was initially the period for the lands. And you have a lot, you encounter this term in canon law, where believers are expected to fast like a Sărăcusta, that is a set of 40 days if they want to be readmitted, or 2 sets if they have to be admitted in the church. So and the origin of these 40 prayers for the dead is actually in the Byzantine period. There is a writing called the Vision of Isaiah the Monk, which explains how high rank official from Nicomedia, paid the priests to perform a set of 40 liturgies, and he discovered that they are actually effective. And this story was adopted by Barnuel Malaxas, who wrote an influential Nomocanon, and then in turn this was translated into Romanian in the 17th century. And you have these all these details in the these canon law texts. And now to move close to my conclusions, Coresis Post still contains the earliest and most extensive patristic citation in the history of the reception of church fathers in the Romanian context. And this extensive fragment was actually taken from the commentary on Matthew by Musculus. And the Reformed theologian himself selects from Chrysostom a fragment that he uses for polemical purposes. He criticizes practices and beliefs encountered in 16th century Catholicism. And the Romanian author, although he maintains the polemical dimension of Musculus's interpretation, he applies it differently. He targets the cult of the dead and seeks to change the fate of those who have passed into the afterlife. And another example about the reception of Chrysostom concerns the Palm Sunday sermon, in which the author says that he asks why did Jesus enter Jerusalem on a donkey, and he then gives 4 reasons, which he takes from John Chrysostom, and he says because Jesus wanted to teach us to despise the honor of this world, because he wanted to give his disciples a measure of joy and happiness, and thirdly because he wants to show that he does not flee from death, he does not fear death, and in the fourth aspect is because the donkey symbolized the Jewish race, and the untamed colt, Matthew mentions also she donkey and the colt, because the colt symbolizes the pagans. So it's meant to convey to suggest that both the Gentiles and the Jews worship together Christ. And when you look at the commentary of Musculus, you find this section with all the reasons marked with orange. And then you, when you go to the text itself, you see that Musculus actually has more information. He is more detailed. And this comes from the homilies on Matthew and by Chrysostom. And the last aspect concerns even the idea of justification by faith, which I initially thought was maybe taken from a collection of such witnesses, but it turns out, and I've discovered this just recently, that this comes from the Loci Communes, from the systematic theology of Musculus. And the Romanian English translation says something like that. Thus speaks Athanasius in the exposition he wrote in Galatians, that only faith has the power to save. Likewise, John Zlatust, Chrysostom says in his second homily on Romans, not with sweat, not with toil will you obtain salvation, etc. And then there is also a reference to Basil in his humility. And so we have all these names. We have Athanasius ad Galatas Tertio. We have also the reference to Chrysostom, to Romans, both the second and the 7th homily, and also Basil, which is the last homilia de humilitate. So it's basically from what Musculus presented, from the many quotations he gave. He mentioned also Hilarius. The Romanian author just selected what he thought was best: Athanasius, Chrysostom, and the Great. So that's okay. That's the end of my presentation. Now I should add that there is much more to discover, and I've already written 4 articles. The 5th is in the making, and it will probably become a book in the end because I'm so fascinated by the subject. I won't have rest until I actually finish a book. So thank you very much.
So time for questions for Emanuel. I guess I'd like to start out. Can you say anything as to how you think the Romanian author or compiler of the homilies got access to Musculus's work. So I'm thinking about cross-fertilization by traveling and so on and so forth.
We know that Musculus's books were circulating in Transylvania. We know that Hungarian students went to study abroad and they brought back commentaries. Now, this aspect is not particularly clear to me, how the Romanian author would have got hold of this book, because on one hand, he does seem to have a theological education, which indicates he might have studied abroad. On the other hand, he does make some mistakes which show that he's not at the level of the Musculus or other reforms who are top-notch scholars. So he might have got his education. I assume he knows Latin. It's obvious that he knows good Hungarian. So what kind of education he might have had, it's not at all clear to me. And scholars who have written on this are not in agreement. So what kind of milieu would have made this possible? And that's in large part because much archival material was destroyed. So the archive of the Reformed College in one of the cities nearby was twice burned, either by the Tatars, sometimes by the Wallachians coming from the south. So we lost so much information that I'm not sure that we could recover this, but maybe Hungarian scholars who know very well the context of concerning the pilgrimage of Hungarian students would be able to say more on this. So I defer to the scholarship of such scholars who know best how books were distributed in Reformed circles, the Hungarian-speaking context.
Mhm.
So,
Thank you.
yeah, I would have to be very humble as Basil recommends.
Starting out, I understand that. Other questions for Emanuel? It's an absolutely fascinating project. And I think it's great how you were able to discover this connection.
Yeah, that's I think grace from God. It comes as because I just decided to test an intuition and proved right. So it was quite a surprise, and it's the second time that this happened because David Pareus is quoted in another collection of sermons published in 1683, and he quotes a Latin proverb, which I sort of then traced. I found out the Romanian author uses a proverb, and I then discovered by searching the Latin form that it comes from Pareus, from a commentary on Genesis. So it's can be sort of a good.
Absolutely fascinating. Just that cross-fertilization, of communities at the time in the 16th century, where you wouldn't necessarily have thought that there was an awful lot of overlap, and here we're finding that out.
Yeah, Romanian scholars were also very surprised because for a long time we thought that maybe it's a apostle translated from Ruthenian, from Slavonic, and people were so focused on looking eastwards that they completely missed the fact that you could actually have Western source and this kind of cross fertilization, and especially that you have this theological influence as early as 1567 in a Romanian context. And I find that fascinating.
And then carefully adapted for the local circumstances,
Yeah.
which I think is a great thing too. Right. Any other questions then for Emanuel?
How much do we know about this man Carresi? He was a deacon,
Yeah, he was a deacon.
but he's reading Reformed books, so that's a very curious.
He publishes also a lot of books in Slavonic for the Wallachian princes. So he's an Orthodox who is invited to work. I think I like to say that he's the first Romanian who joined the European Union, because he's sort of he has this kind of idea that, of course, work with other people who are from a different religious context, and I think he's the specialist, the guy who can print books, and he decides to print whoever will pay for them. So he sells his technical skills, and he's aware in a certain sense that there is dynamite in this book for his own tradition. And I just assumed that he decided to print it anyway, considering that because there are the church fathers mentioned, and this means that it cannot be bad. So he's aware that a lot of things are criticized, a lot of things which are actually, in a sense, essential for his own tradition. But because it's an area where you have not defined the theological boundaries very clear, people are not aware. They can experiment with a lot of things. And in the next century, you have people who would like to, who actually criticize the Lutherans and the Calvinist theologians. And after almost like 100 years, there is a synod in Iași in the province of Moldavia, which clearly rejects Calvinism and treats it as a heresy. And so the boundaries are set. So there is a book of sermons published in Moldavia, which seeks to actually affirm everything that is Orthodox, the cult of the saints, devotion to Mary, and worship of the cross. So there are sermons in which actually the Orthodox author says that why we venerate the cross, and why the Lutherans or the Reformed don't get it. So it's a much more charged environment. But I think it's this kind of theology. So in a sense, after 80 years or a century, there is a response coming from the neighboring provinces, and there is a harsh polemic. I think there
Let
may
me
be
try and see,
someone
there may be people coming in. I want to make sure that the questions.
Raise their hand.
Yep, let's try and figure, have I stopped share? Okay. So of our people online, was there someone who wanted to ask a question? Yes, Benjamin, go ahead and unmute and ask your question.
Thank you for your interesting presentation. Do you hear me all?
Yeah, please.
Okay, great. I wondered if you found some pattern in which way he uses musculus only to have a resource for church fathers, or you showed also this reference then he added to this Orthodox priest with the crosses. But did you find some pattern, and in which cases or in which situations he uses musculus in some sort of way?
My initial assessment is that out of the 66 sermons published in this style, maybe 15 use musculus as a source. But because musculus is not yet translated into English, I have to work through the Latin text very slowly. So I'm not yet I'm not a classical scholar by training. I'm a biblical scholar. So I wish I knew more, able to read musculus with ease and be able to answer the question right away. My sense is that whenever there is something of an encyclopedic nature, like in John, there is this pool in which the Jews used to wash the entrails after sacrificing the sheep, and he uses what he finds interesting, and I think it's also mainly what has to do with criticizing the others and the practices that are considered to be non-biblical. And Musculus provides the arguments in a way which is meaningful for the Romanian author. So defending, for instance, the idea of justification by faith, explaining certain words, but I haven't been able to find a pattern, and that's because I'm only at the beginning. I think that Theophylact of Ohrid is also used as a source, and there is an interesting allegory that is taken by Musculus from Theophylact that our author also uses. So I'll be able to answer that when I've done research as much as possible. I'd like to do that in an exhaustive manner, but I'll keep in mind the question and maybe include it as an answer in the book that I plan.
All right. In general, then, thank you very much. And then this is going to be perfect, and we will thank Emanuel for his presentation. And now we will get things set up for Jeb's presentation. So let's sort a few things up right now. Let's see. I want to start here. Let's figure out where we are. Down the bottom. There it is. Okay. I'm going to, okay, Sam, I've made you a co-host, okay? That's good. Yes, okay, now I'm going to find the the second PowerPoint, which is here.
Can you turn up the sound as well?
On
In
the,
your
on the
computer,
laptop, I can
so
try,
that whenever somebody comes in.
so long as it's off. I think I had already, but I'll try again and we'll see if it works again. Okay. Now, let's get back here. Okay, share screen is what I want to do. And we are going to be here.
Right.
And share. And let's start slideshow. See if it comes on from the.
There we go.
Okay,
Let
ooh, there,
we go.
all right, perfect.
Excellent.
All yours.
me just pull this up.
Yeah, and just watch your feet, don't kick that cable out.
All right. Thanks for the kind introduction, Royer. This has been a really fabulous last month, getting to just kind of get a really concentrated time working on part of my dissertation that's coming up. But a disclaimer, I am not a Beza expert. That would be my advisor. So if I make any glaring mistakes, Dr. Manich, if you watch this recording, I'm sorry. But I'm really indebted to the work, first and foremost, of Kirk Summers and J.B. Fillet, who've done a lot of work recently on Theodore Beza's annotations on the New Testament. So the last couple of weeks, I've been spending a lot of time in the various editions of Theodore Beza's annotations on the New Testament. What I'm going to be doing today is basically what I've done in the last couple of weeks. It fits into two larger contexts. The first is my dissertation research, which analyzes debates surrounding the doctrine of original sin as it took place within Reformation commentaries on Romans, especially how they were reading Romans 5 and debating Romans 5. The second context is that this fits into a chapter I'm doing on Genevan commentaries, specifically Calvin's, Ochino's, and others. About a year ago, I presented some research at the ICCR, basically looking at the ways in which Calvin develops his comments on Romans 5:12 through 14, specifically in sort of a polemical context against Erasmus and Origen. So in some ways, what I'm doing here is an extension of that, kind of fitting it into those two sort of larger contexts. But the last couple of weeks here focus specifically on Theodore Beza's annotations on the New Testament, specifically his reading, his translation, and his commentary on Romans 5:12. And what I'm going to argue here is this. I'm going to argue that Beza's reading of Romans 5:12 and his annotations can be viewed as his attempt to bring Calvinistic and Augustinian doctrine and scriptural exegesis into unison against his theological and philological opponents, namely that of Erasmus, Castellio, Origen, and Pigius. So here's what I'm going to do. We're going to look at kind of a brief history of the controversial nature of Romans 5:12 throughout the Western Latin exegetical tradition. Next, I'm going to briefly summarize Erasmus's and Calvin's readings of Romans 5:12. And then from there, I'm going to give an account of Beza's philological and theological developments on the verse from 1556 to 1598. All right, so a brief kind of crash course into the controversial nature of Romans 5:12 as sort of the origin for original sin. So Romans 5:12 has been well known for being sort of the locus classicus for the doctrine of original sin throughout the Western Latin exegetical tradition, stemming back to around the late 4th and early 5th centuries, when really we began to see the first major renaissance on Pauline literature. And this was among writers such as the anonymous Ambrosiaster, Jerome, Pelagius, Rufinus, who was the reason we have Origen's Romans commentary is it survived through Rufinus's Latin translation, and as well as Augustine. So today, most English translations offer a rendering of Romans 5:12 in the following way. And I've cited the NASB, the ESV, and the RSV. Quote, "Therefore, just as through one man sin entered into the world, and death through sin, and so death spread to all mankind, because all sinned." Biblical scholars today recognize that Augustine was working with a different manuscript, which rendered the final clause of the sentence as a relative clause rather than as a causal or a conditional clause. This aided Augustine in reading the verse along these sort of lines. Quote, Sin came into the world through one man, and death came through sin, and so death spread to all, in whom all have sinned. Romans 5:12 was an important verse in the debates Augustine had with his Pelagian opponents regarding the doctrine of original sin. For Augustine, humanity inherited the guilt and corruption of Adam's sin because of its real participation and solidarity in Adam's sin. Pelagius, on the other hand, interpreted this verse in this way. Quote, "And so death passed upon all people, in that all sinned. So long as they sinned the same way, they likewise died." And this was to imply that Adam's progeny really only participate in Adam's sin when they imitate it willfully. However, dogmatized at the Council of Carthage in 418 and the Second Council of Orange in 529. And this was also transmitted through the ordinary gloss and the glossa magnatura throughout the Middle Ages. However, it was by the time of the 15th, 16th century that this exegetical consensus began to shift. And this was when humanists such as Jacques Lefebvre de Pabla and Erasmus, who were following in the path of Lorenzo Valla, brought their linguistic and their philological tools to bear upon the biblical text. So Erasmus comes to the scene and he introduces a radical rereading of this verse, which prompted fierce backlash from the likes of Edward Lee and Franz Tiedemann. He was first criticized in his 1516 translation in his Novum Instrumentum, but would garner even more backlash by his subsequent translations of the verse in his 1519 Novum Testamentum by translating it as Quatenus omne peccavimus, that is to say, insofar as we all have sinned. Erasmus saw Romans 5:12 in a similar light as Pelagius. Rather than seeing it as the grounds for the hereditary transmission of original sin, Erasmus viewed the transmission of Adam's sin in this passage strictly through the lens of a pattern of imitation of that first sin. And what had happened is that Erasmus was inadvertently using Pelagius's commentary to defend himself against Pelagian accusations. At the time, commentaries by the name of Jerome were being passed around, and Erasmus recognized that this was probably spurious. This was likely not Jerome, but he recognized it as a pseudo-Jerome and still somewhat of a valid authority to appeal to. So as is well known at this point, Erasmus's biblical scholarship was well utilized by a large array of reformers in the 16th century. And Calvin was no exception to this. Calvin made frequent use of Erasmus throughout his biblical commentaries. And as I argued last year, Calvin actually follows one of Erasmus's suggestions on Romans 5:12. So he follows Erasmus's suggestion on how we should interpret this Greek "epho" clause at the end of the verse. But this didn't mean that he followed Erasmus theologically in how he read the verse. While Calvin moved away from this sort of traditional Old Latin rendering of the verse, he was still able to locate the sin of this verse as being that of original sin. But he remains somewhat ambiguous in the way that he explains how Adam's progeny actually participate with Adam in that sin, making them liable to guilt. And I actually think the reason for Calvin's ambiguity on this point of the imputation of guilt is because of his following of Erasmus on how to read this verse. So as we'll see, Beza and Calvin's doctrines are not super far off on this doctrine, despite the fact that many have pointed out that it's a point of contention between the two. But there does appear to be a sort of correlation between the ambiguity and the rigidity of their exegesis on this verse. So with that established, a large context established, now let's go to Beza. So Theodore Beza's, sorry, let me go ahead and, I'm really bad at slides. Let's go. There we go. Theodore Beza's work as a theologian and a biblical humanist was deeply impacted by both John Calvin and Erasmus. His biblical scholarship was prolific, and in recent years, it has begun to receive a little surge of attention among some scholars, especially that of Herb Summers, Jennifer Powell, Nutt, and others. Beza wrote 5 major editions of his New Testament translation and corresponding annotations on the text over the course of more than 40 years, or almost 40 years, between 1556 and 1598. Over 40 years. I should be better than that. This project began at the behest of Robert Estienne, who looked to Calvin to do this, who then looked to Beza to do this. And this was a tremendous undertaking. And what he wanted was a new translation of the New Testament from varying Greek manuscript sources with an accompanying collection of notes or annotations to go along with it. So the first edition of these annotations was completed in 1556, which is the same year as Calvin's final edition of his Romans commentary as well in 1556. And I actually think that Calvin likely made use of Beza's annotations as he was using them for his final edition. That's a whole nother thing, but Beza completed this in 1556. It wasn't published until 1557. But this first edition was a very rushed project, and it was the only edition that did not include the Greek text printed within it. And it only listed the Vulgate as well as Beza's new translation. The 4th edition of the annotations were published in 1589. And according to Kirk Summers, in email correspondence, he said he viewed this as the most mature and the most fully coherent work of the annotations. However, I do find it very interesting that the final edition, his 5th edition of the annotations that he published in 1598, actually has massive insertions and quite big revisions throughout his annotations, but there's also a lot of errors throughout it, printing errors, sort of grammatical errors. But I think it's helpful to consider the fact that Beza was almost 80 when he published these, so extremely old and extremely prolific into his later age. So in 1555, during the production of the first edition, Beza wrote to Heinrich Bullinger that this new translation only made a few changes to the Vulgate, and it did not seek to go as far as the changes that Erasmus had made in his own translation. Functionally, this is only partially true of Beza's work. While Beza criticized Erasmus for sometimes unjustly criticizing the Vulgate, Beza still saw serious problems with the Vulgate. However, it's my impression that Beza saw the work of his theological and philological opponents as a greater threat than what he saw to be the internal mistakes of the Vulgate. From the offset, Beza's new translation of the New Testament was an attempt to offer a translation to compete with Erasmus's and Sebastian Castellio's translations. As stated previously, Erasmus's works were prevalent and well read in the middle of the 16th century. However, in 1551, Calvin and Beza's Genevan rival, Sebastian Castellio, released his own Latin Bible translation with his own corresponding annotations. Castellio was sharply criticized for his rejection of some key doctrines of the magisterial reformers, such as that of total depravity, justification sola fide, and even follows Erasmus on his reading of the final part of Romans 5:12. So you can kind of see both of those are identical at the very end. And Castellio even adds a little comment on that, on Quatenus, to essentially to say that only the only people that are participating in Adam's sin are those who are of the age to actually do it. That is willful sin. This can't be corresponding to original sin. It has to be a reference to actual sin. So one interesting thing I've discovered in the 1556 edition that I found by reading through secondary literature from Irina Bacchus and Asa Gudrian. Is that Gudrian? Gudrian? Thank you. They documented that Beza considered Castellio a semi-Pelagian, and that this is likely the first reported instance of the word semi-Pelagian. And this happens in his 1556 edition of the annotations in a comment on Galatians. So with this in mind, with the sort of polemical context in mind, let's look at some of the developments here in Beza's annotations on Romans 5:12. So these are a kind of a list of translations from 1556, 1604. I've left some omitted. That just means there's there weren't any changes in between from those subsequent editions. So I don't have all the time to go into the developments that I've spotted on this verse, but I do want to just pick up on some really kind of interesting things that I found here. I'll start first with Beza's comment on the word sin, pekatum. He writes that this sin mentioned is frequently referred to as, quote, that hereditary disease that brings forth, quote, threefold fruits corresponding to both the movements of sin as well as the willful consent to those movements of sin. So he makes a distinction between original sin and actual sins. Beza, likely following Augustine, points to the fact that the word hamartia is in the singular and not the plural. And he finds this a good time to go on a polemical and theological tangent against both Origen and Erasmus. One thing that I found really interesting is that both Calvin and Beza like to use the word, or both like to describe Origen's exegesis as him having these sort of hallucinations or these sort of delusions in which he's just kind of gone off into this sort of fanciful realm of just kind of over speculation. But he goes on this tangent against Origen and Erasmus. He argues that Erasmus would have done much better in his annotations if he had just followed Augustine rather than following Origen in his own annotations. And it's interesting that Origen actually is probably the biggest enemy in Beza's annotations. I think there's somewhere over 80 different references to Origen, and almost all of them, I think except for one or two, are overwhelmingly negative. And the theory is that by critiquing Origen, he's essentially critiquing the wellspring of theology that Castellio and Erasmus are both kind of getting at. So from here, he follows Augustine by making this sort of distinction about original sin. He writes that, quote, two things are to be considered in original sin, namely guilt and corruption, which cannot be separated, but they must be accurately distinguished. Adam, he goes on, first became guilty after he sinned, and on account of his guilt, he suffered punishment. That is both the corruption of the mind and of the body. Beza adds that it was not just Adam who bore this guilt and punishment, but that he, quote, transmitted to his posterity a nature both guilty at first, but then corrupted. And this will be important as we get into this. In the section following this, Beza sees Origen's reading opening the door for Pelagian interpretations of this verse. He even starts to state the suspicion of those commentaries that were written under the name of Jerome, which had been circulating around. But what we see in his 1588 edition is that Beza actually amends his comment and notes explicitly that these commentaries were almost certainly written by Pelagius himself, especially as he's been reading Augustine's earlier works against Pelagius and recognizing that some of the things Augustine are saying about Pelagius's commentary are the same thing that he's reading in pseudo Jerome. So it's interesting to see kind of over these years that he's putting things together. So now on to this controversial prepositional clause, eth ho. When confronted by the Greek, Beza makes a really, really strange decision and just basically converting the Latin relative clause in quo into the Greek relative construction en ho. So he's basically letting the Latin sort of dictate. So he's going defiantly against Erasmus's controversial suggestion, who Beza writes in this section, quote, that Erasmus tenaciously holds the most disgusting error which he once seized, namely that this refers to the sins of imitation, going back to Pelagius. Beza argues that a similar construction can be found in Hebrews 9:17, and that Greek dictionaries attest to the fact that the preposition eth can be taken for en. However, in his 1565 edition, he removes this line about the Greek dictionaries, probably realizing that it's not true. Also, in his 1565 edition, he adds a comment that this clause cannot be referring to Adam's sin, but rather only to Adam himself. The idea that either relative reading in this clause can refer to either Adam or Adam's sin is actually something that stems back to Augustine. And this was something that was retained in the ordinary gloss until Erasmus challenged it. However, what I find really interesting is that by making this specifically about being in Adam rather than opening it up to being basically two different interpretations, he's being more theologically restrictive than even Augustine. So Beza will continue to double down on his reading of Romans 5:12 over the years, as he adds in his 1588 edition that his clause thoroughly conveys the reason why sin and death pervaded into all people from one man. He says there's no other reason it is able to be conveyed. He also adds in his 1588 edition that the causal reading of this clause has been refuted by Augustine, quote, 1,000 times. We can even see from Beza's translation of the verse the way in which he attempts to make this reading even more explicit. So, I mean, as you even look at this, the 1598 edition in the 1604, you can see that he includes this sort of what we would do is by inserting sort of brackets to say, this isn't me saying it, but this is me basically telling you what it's referring to. And he's actually making his reading more and more explicit to being that sort of in Adam reading of that final clause. So as he's going throughout the years, his reading is not becoming more ambiguous, it's becoming more theologically restrictive. One thing that I found really interesting as I was doing work on 4th and 5th century Latin readings of Paul, one of the earliest Latin commentaries that we have on Romans does the same exact thing. So you can see that in quo id est in Adam. It makes that sort of insertion to say this is what it's referring to. And so in some ways, what Beza is doing here is not unique. And in many ways, he's probably actually interacting with this commentary. So I found that quite interesting. So following his comments on in quo, he moves into the final words of this verse, omne peccarunt. This section of his annotation saw a tremendous amount of revision, insertions, as well as deletions, as Beza wrestled with how he read the verse to conceptualize all of humanity's sinning in Adam, which brought with it both the corruption and the guilt of human nature. And the general progression of the editions of this place are as follows. As you can see, from 1556 to 1565, he makes a major deletion. He makes a little addition in 1582 and 1588. And then the 1598, as you can see at the bottom of the screen, includes a massive insertion that going on and on about what he just sort of details surrounding the doctrine of original sin, him denying traducianism, telling his readers that he's a creationist about the soul. He appeals to predestination in understanding how it is that Adam's sin can be accounted guilty and corrupt on account of Adam. So there's a lot he goes into, surprisingly, in this final edition. But what happens here is that Beza remains consistent on the notion that Paul is referring here both to original guilt and corruption. And the emphasis for Beza is on original guilt, since, as he stated earlier, this verse regards the transmission of a nature that was first made guilty by Adam's sin and then corrupted on account of its guilt. By reading this alone, it is a bit difficult to say who Beza has in mind here and who he sort of has, why is he pushing this point so firmly. However, if we consider the Romans lecture notes from Beza's student, Marcus Wilder, on this verse, we can begin to see a fuller picture. And this is basically some handwritten notes from one of Beza's students that was recently published several years ago. And this is a really helpful sort of supplemental work to help kind of understand what he's doing in Romans. But Beza in his lecture recognizes himself as fighting a twofold battle. He's fighting in one direction against those he considers the Pelagians and the semi-Pelagians, that is Castellio, Erasmus, and others. But in the opposite direction, he's fighting against those he labels the Papists, who in this case, I think the main figure he has in mind here is Albert Pigius. Pigius saw Adam's sin as corrupting his progeny and making them liable to punishment. but that this sin was not his progeny's sin. This sin remained to Adam alone. So in other words, for Pigius, Adam's sin is not our sin, even though we are still held liable for it. Without an account of human solidarity in sin, Pigius could not arrive at a coherent doctrine of original sin. So on one side, Beza was arguing against Pigius, who he saw as denying our participation in Adam's sin, while nevertheless still making us liable to sort of punishment and corruption. But on the other side, he was arguing against Erasmus and the Pelagians, who argued that the only sort of participation we play in Adam's sin is that of our own willful imitation of Adam's sin. But what each side shared in common was a denial of this real human solidarity in Adam's sin. And this was something that Beza sought to correct. For Beza, original guilt must be maintained. As he writes from the 1582 edition and on, quote, he is not dealing here with corruption, but with the propagation of original guilt. End quote. It cannot be that God merely punishes Adam's progeny for no sin of their own. The punishment is theirs because they share in the guilt of Adam's sin. And Calvin and Beza both had this problem posed by Pigius in mind when they wrote their comments on Romans 5:12. Calvin himself on this verse wrote, quote, for there are some who argue that we were so destroyed on account of Adam's sin as if we perished through no fault of our own, but only as if he had sinned for us. End quote. So with this context in mind, we can begin to see the fuller picture of why Beza contested so strongly and consistently for this old Latin reading and rendering of the verse. Beza, in his final edition, concludes this section refuting Traducian doctrine and by writing that scripture does indeed teach original sin, but he ends with a probing question for his readers. He asks, why do we not rather seek the means by which this corruption can be driven out of us, rather than seeking the reason for how it began in us? End quote. Beza's final word on the matter is that we should not probe too curiously into these mysteries of the faith. Interesting. So caught between the papist, like Pigius, and the Pelagians, such as Erasmus and Castellio, Romans 5:12 became Beza's battleground for maintaining humanity's solidarity in Adam's sin, which resulted in humanity's guilt and corruption. This magnified consideration of Beza's commentary on one lone verse throughout his annotations on the New Testament, spanning over 40 years, has revealed a few things regarding Beza's work as both a philologist and a theologian. First, it must be said that Beza never stopped working as an exegete of Holy Scripture. Yet his aims were not that of a 21st century exegete. Both Beza and Calvin, true to the humanist Lotzi method, allowed for a sort of symbiotic relationship between their theology and exegesis. And we can see explicitly how Beza's translation and theological interpretation, Romans 5:12, sort of support this idea. While Calvin was comfortable following Erasmus's translation, he still rejected Erasmus's theological reading of Romans 5:12. On the other hand, Beza was neither comfortable with Erasmus's translation nor the Pelagian reading that this could potentially offer to the untrained reader. Beza could not afford the luxury of any ambiguity on this highly contested text, especially as he saw his work as attempting to replace and critique the philological work of Erasmus and Castellio, while also attempting to suffocate the theological ideas of Pigius, Origen, and Pelagius. So I chose a very loaded question for the title of this presentation. Was Beza a dogmatic Erasmus? I really don't think Beza would have enjoyed me asking this question. But I do think there's a sort of merit to the idea that Beza wanted to be his own tradition's Erasmus, providing a sort of robust translation on the New Testament that remained conducive to Calvinistic theology. And while Erasmus was not in himself adogmatic or unbiased in his philological endeavors, it is clear that Beza was much more comfortable and even quite explicit in the way that he allowed certain established dogma to guide his philology, especially in light of the theological battles faced. For Beza, scripture needed to be read and translated with all the scientific and linguistic tools at his disposal, but also according to a proper rule of faith. As good doctrine was not seen for Beza to be an enemy to the proper reading of scripture, but as an inseparable ally to true understanding. So was Beza a dogmatic Erasmus? In a way, kind of. But ultimately, I don't think we should allow such a question to subtract from the ways in which Beza was simply Beza. Thanks.
Cheers, we can see everybody. There we go, we can see everyone, great. Questions, obviously Beza was one of many people in Geneva interested in the Bible. There's Calvin, there's Beza, but there's a lot of colleagues as well. And some of the work that was done on producing the Bible in a new French translation was actually done by a team in Geneva in the 1580s. What do you know about the others who are part of this story? We've got Calvin, we've got Beza, but in Geneva, outside Geneva, right? Who else is Calvin working alongside with?
Well, he's certainly working with the team working on the English translation. I mean, he's one of the really fascinating things that I've actually picked up on in Irina Bacchus's dissertation research is the fact that the commission on the Genevan English Bible, one of the points of contention that she's actually recognizing among these sort of group of translators is that there's a big disagreement over how this verse should actually be. They should go with Beza's suggestion. And ultimately the committee says, recommends not going with Beza on sticking to this old translation. But what we find in the English, the first major English translation is Beza's, the Inquo Vulgate rendering of it.
Right.
I'm not super well trained in the French translation side of this, but I know there's a lot of people that work here.
Yeah, no, I think it's worth thinking about, right? I mean, they're in a team, right? So there's more than just Beza and Calvin
Right.
operating in this, I think, is worth thinking about.
Yeah, that's great.
Good.
Helpful.
Other questions for Jeff, either from our online colleagues or go ahead, Emanuel.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I was intrigued by the fact that you mentioned that Origen is the arch enemy of Beza. Does he work from the Latin version of the commentary on Romans?
Yes. There's no Greek, there's no surviving
Yeah.
Greek.
So in that case, they are aware that it's actually not Origin pure and simple. It's
Right.
the
Rufinus.
Rufinus, yes.
Yeah, and so
Do
it's
they make some allowances for the fact
Well-
that it's actually a translation, or it's?
so I think in the prologue to so I think Rufinus even says himself that it's a condensing of the work.
Mhm,
And I think they're aware of the fact that if they're taking him at his word, that it is a
okay.
condensing, whether or not they see that as him being true to the
Mhm, okay.
spirit.
And one other question related to that. To what extent are other church fathers used who are preserved in
Yes.
Greek used in the debates like John Chrysostom or others who have written on Romans? Are they used
Yeah.
to I don't know, influence
Right.
the discussion? And if
Certainly.
so, can you
Certainly.
give us certain examples?
Yeah, I think especially among Calvin and Beza, but far and away the most glorified kind of father is Augustine. So they're not always
From the Greek.
from the Greek. Yeah, Chrysostom's there. Obviously Calvin saw Chrysostom as like one of his favorite exegetes, if not his favorite exegete, although Augustine he considered his favorite theologian. Beza is in my reading more negative of almost everyone except for Augustine. And even with Augustine, he's still quite critical. And so he does bring up, I think, I mean, Chrysostom's there, Origen's obviously there. Need to pull, there's a chart I can actually send you of all of the major references he makes, but he's not referencing a ton of them.
But Beza's translation in Latin was also used in the Romanian context. It influenced the first Romanian
Interesting.
edition of 1648, and some solutions in the Romanian translation actually go back to the Latin of Beza rather than the Greek text. So it's interesting that he actually left marks even in a Romanian context.
wow.
And the chapter
I didn't know that.
headings are all Beza, so
Okay.
it's very well
There we
done
go.
also in the Romanian context.
Other questions, Lyle?
Yeah, if I understood you correctly, you're saying that for Beza, human corruption follows as punishment for human guilt, right? Weren't there other Reformed theologians of the time who argued just the opposite, that we're guilty because
Yes.
we're corrupt? Oh,
Right, and this is where I find Beza really interesting, because Beza is really kind of leaning into this more like traditional Augustinian way of thinking.
so he's kind of an outlier here.
He is, I have compiled basically like a massive list of how all the different reformers who wrote on Romans translated this verse. And he is one of two that I know of. Ecolampadius is the other one who sticks with the in quo clause, despite the fact that he worked with Erasmus. But yeah, Beza's, I mean, you think of someone like Zwingli, who is very different on this point, like
That's what I was thinking of.
yeah, I mean, he obviously changes his views on original sin after Marburg, but his views were sort of an outlying view in his own right. But even even as I kind of referenced, like Calvin and Beza even kind of disagree on this, but I don't think they saw it as too big of a difference. Like I think they both saw the sort of issues at hand and how that they need to be resolved in some sort of way. But Beza really does sort of lean more traditional in the way he tackles the doctrine of original sin. But then he sort of starts pulling in his kind of more like predestinarian elements into how he thinks about it, conceptualizes it. But you're right, I think Beza is kind of a...
Does that Beza's view have a longer trajectory into the Reformed theological tradition?
So I was thinking about that even today when I was like, where does like the federalist view of like this kind of play in with Beza? And I frankly haven't studied it enough to even know. But I mean, there's a reason that like the Westminster Confession still maintains both imputation of guilt and the corruption. So the both guilty and corruption view are there, but I think the ways in which that's spelled out explicitly, whether it's through the sort of realist view that we are sort of really present in Adam when he sinned, or versus just kind of Adam sinned as our federal head, and therefore we're guilty on behalf of the fact that he was our representative. So I think it's there in parts, I guess.
Okay.
It's a good question.
Thank you.
Other questions? Any questions from our group online? Does anybody there have a question? If so, you can raise your hand. We've got a group here looking at us. Looks okay there. Anybody here on, go ahead, Paul.
Yes, in your presentation, you talked about Beza being a creationist. When you say he was a creationist, were you talking about the fact that God creates soul into human beings?
Right.
Because later on, I think theologians, later Reformation theologians, particularly from the New Haven theologians, they will come out and say that the idea of the hereditary origin of sin creates God as evil because the infants are born in evil. I wonder how to that.
And I think he kind of, in his final edition, sort of is picking up on that fact, where he's saying, well, if God is creating people as sort of prototypes of Adam and Eve, who were, we share in the sort of their sort of willful sin, this guilty sin, but he starts kind of shifting it into this language of like this sort of mysterious counsel, this admirable counsel of God that reveals his wrath as well as his mercy. He sort of starts deferring it into both this category of just sort of God's mysterious sovereignty, and then kind of diverts with that final question of saying, you know, we shouldn't really be exploring these sorts of questions. We should be thinking about how do we get rid of sin, not how did sin begin. Great question, thanks.
Any other questions right now? If not, please join me in thanking Jeff very much for the presentation.